Out of 195 countries on Earth, there are about 39 developed countries, according to the International Monetary Fund in 2020. Out of all these 39 developed countries, Australia is in the upper tier in terms of GDP per capita. Australia is also ranked as the 4th most free market to do business in. Its residents are the 7th most educated in the world. Its cities are some of the most livable in our world, with 4 out of the top 10 most livable cities located in this country. But if you do move to Australia today, you will soon find out there is one thing that you do not see often on Aussie streets: electric vehicles. Even if you do want to buy one for yourself, you will find the situation being extremely limiting in terms of which brands of electric cars you can actually get. For example, Volkswagen announced that their latest electric cars won't come to Australia until 2023, a whole 2 years behind Europe. In fact, out of all the cars sold in Australia in 2020, only 0.7% of them were electric. If it were in the UK, this same number would be 11%, Canada 3.5%, and the United States 2.2%. If you dig a bit deeper into the data, you will soon figure out Australia as a country has made virtually zero progress in commercializing electric vehicles in its domestic market. It has kept its electric car percentage of new cars sold at less than 1% ever since there were electric cars in the market. Welcome to 1kg CO2, and in today's video we will try to understand why. Why does Australia have a third world electric car market? Doesn't Australia worry about it trailing behind other developed countries? What are the plans for the Aussies who actually want to get EVs? This phrase of third world means a country that has some of its economic fields and systems underdeveloped with underwhelming performance numbers when compared to other countries in the world. And in our case, electric car sales, as a percentage of all car sales, the world average is 4.2%, and Australia 0.7%, 6 times lower than the world average. Different from most consumer goods problems, Australia's lack of EVs is not due to Aussies not wanting any, quite the opposite. In a survey by the Electric Vehicle Council, half of the Australians would actually consider buying an electric car as their next vehicle. However, most people were stopped when they do the maths trying to decide between an electric car or a traditional petrol car. It's simple. Electric vehicles cost more, way more, typically more than $10,000 more expensive than a similarly spec'd petrol equivalent. In Europe and America, this $10,000 gap is closed by the government in the form of incentives. You either receive tax breaks or cash credits when you buy an electric vehicle there. In Australia, what the government offers is only free vehicle registration in most states for you to buy an electric vehicle to begin with, and that's it. What's even worse, if you are from Victoria, the second most populated state in Australia, you will actually be taxed for driving a car that's not a petrol car. A tax on electric vehicles. That's a world's first. This EV tax costs about 2.5 cents per kilometer of travel, so the government can reclaim the fuel excise from you since you're no longer buying any petrol. This means if you do own a Tesla Model 3 in Victoria and charge your car at home, the electricity cost in Australia is about 21 cents per kilowatt hours, and your Tesla drives on average at 0.15 kilowatt hours to the kilometer. This road tax turns out to be an additional 80% premium on top of your vehicle running cost. That Australia is also a huge country in terms of geography. It is the 6th largest country on Earth by land area. A huge challenge for Australia is to actually install enough EV charging points in its regional areas to support an EV ecosystem. And the charging station needs to get electricity from the grid, and this is also the most important sustainability metric, because we as consumers prefer electric vehicles because we want to be sustainable. We want electric vehicles to be carbon free. This carbon-free nature of electric vehicles is not guaranteed though. It depends on how the energy used is actually generated. Currently in Australia, the energy mix is like this. 79% of Australia's electricity is generated from either coal or natural gas, both carbon-intensive sources of emission. If we compare this energy mix to Canada, it's actually almost the exact opposite, as Canada generates 80% of its energy from non-emitting sources, including renewables and nuclear. This is clearly another area where Australia is behind other developed countries. This 80% number is actually almost exactly the same as China's, and it seems like Australia will continue to increase its fossil fuel consumption, as the Australian government announced a natural gas-fired power plant in 2021, despite the report from the International Energy Agency saying there should be no new investments in fossil fuel power plants in anywhere on this planet in order to manage our climate change crisis. Furthermore, because the government doesn't help consumers in buying EVs, EV manufacturers are not shipping their cars to Australia, at least not as a priority. Using Volkswagen as an example, like we introduced in the beginning, this giant automaker said they are no longer considering the Australian markets for EVs in the short term because the operating environment in Australia does not match their government policy expectations, and that Australia is actually hostile to the electric vehicles market because there is no clear next step for this country's carbon reduction goal, and they are not sure how electric vehicles can play a part in Australia's carbon neutral future. Nonetheless, as we all know, Australia is a developed country for a reason. It is running a strong economy, so strong that it never even had a recession for 29 years straight before COVID-19 hit, powering through financial crises like the Asian financial crisis in the early 2000s and the 2008 global crisis. This sort of economic performance is what you would love if you are the government officials, because these are the numbers that keep them elected, keep them in office. This is something all Australians are very proud of. Australia seems to be not only immune from major natural disasters, doesn't have earthquakes, doesn't have tornadoes, doesn't have tsunamis, and it doesn't have financial crisis. And it doesn't have financial crisis because every time when the tap seems to run slow, you can just go to the great outback and dig up something and sell it. The demand for Australian mining exports have been anchored by the Chinese development, and if you tag a GDP figure of China in any recent year, subtract this with the year before, the difference or the growth of the Chinese GDP alone is larger than the entirety of the Australian economy. Saying this, the point I'm trying to make is having a customer like China means endless economic opportunities for this country. But in recent years, this golden relationship might be coming to an end.
China continues to hoover up our resources and is our best customer, yet we've got this tension, this geopolitical tension on the other side of things. Can you cool that down?
Well,
is that possible?
You're right to highlight that COVID is not the only challenge Australia faces. Not only that, natural disasters, and in this budget, as you know, there's a very big plan to support Australians deal with natural disasters and climate change and things like this. But importantly, we're living in a very uncertain region, and that's why we're investing in our intelligence, in our security.
What these world events would translate into Australian domestic politics is that the government officials are a bit worried. They are worried that the Australian economy will soon stagnate, and nobody wants to be the one in office while the economy starts to go downhill after 29 years of miracle-like success. In order to keep the economy rising, Australia turns to what it's always good at: resources. This time is hydrogen. Australia has one of the most abundant sunlights in the world, a relatively endless source of energy, but Australia has a small population, so it cannot consume all that energy alone. This idea to use solar energy to generate electricity, and then the electricity will convert water into hydrogen. This solar energy being stored in the form of hydrogen can become a commercial product and can be shipped to countries around the world for consumption. Unlike wind turbines, where Australia needs to rely on foreign technologies likely from Europe or even China, hydrogen is what Australia plans to use to dominate the world's resource sector once again as a supplier. And if everything goes well, the Australian grid will be carbon neutral as long as the hydrogen is generated through renewables. But before they can do that, even if you electrify all of Australian cars at the moment, Australia will not benefit, as the carbon emission will not be reduced, since the grid still relies on 79% of fossil fuel for generation. In conclusion, electric vehicles are actually a highly desired product by Australians, but the Australian government does not need electric vehicles at the moment. Having electric vehicles expose Australia's highly fossil-dependent energy mix to the world, and there won't be much immediate benefit since 79% of the grid relies on fossil fuels. Secondly, Australia got its place today with a miracle-like economic story because it has always sustained a highly profitable resource export sector. It might be hard for Australia to start buying resources from other countries in the form of renewable technologies for future decades, and it wants to be its own boss when it comes to resource and energy. The way to achieve this is to develop a green hydrogen economy. Before green hydrogen is matured, Australia is not likely to commit to any aggressive climate goals because without hydrogen, reducing carbon requires Australia to import technology instead of export, and fundamentally, this just isn't the Aussie way in global trade.
In our region, but what is our goal? Peace. What is our goal? Trade. What is our goal? Prosperity for our region and sovereignty for every single country that exists in.
So clearly, the Australian way of reaching carbon neutrality is quite a bit different from the mainstream. The mainstream of reducing carbon is to plant in wind turbines, to install solar panels, and then directly connect those wind turbines and solar panels to a pack of battery, and then dispatch that electricity to the grid to be charged into electric vehicles and then cities to be used. In this way, the whole grid is connected and energy does not produce any carbon emission. In this prospective Australian green hydrogen economy way, Australia is planning to install a great number of solar panels, and directly next to the solar panel, it will be hydrogen generation plant. This hydrogen generation plant will receive electricity directly from the solar panel when the sun is actually shining, and then convert water directly into hydrogen to be stored instead of storing electricity in a battery pack. The benefit of this is battery packs are very expensive and really hard to transport because they are very heavy, and having hydrogen means it's not that much different from what we are already used to, fossil fuels. And Australia is announcing new gas-fired power plants for this exact reason, because the future in Australia's best interest is green hydrogen. If you like this video, please consider giving it a like and watching to this point. I know you sort of enjoyed what I'm making here in this channel. Join me, and for every sub, I will remove 1 kg of CO2 off the atmosphere. Subscribe. Thank you so much for watching and have a wonderful day.